that my husband and I have raised 3 kids. They are grown now, but when they were young, we liked to do that thing that we call camping, where you take all your treasured items, right, and you pack them up into the car, and you go to some place so that you can sleep on the ground and smell like smoke and be eaten by mosquitoes. We've been there. We loved that. Well, we had done that one weekend. Our oldest was 7, and we'd been at the campsite for maybe half an hour when he was riding his bike around the little camp road, and on some pine needles, he slipped, and he got the wind totally knocked out of him by the gut to the handlebar, and it was bad, and it hurt. And so he lay down and he rested, and maybe 30, 45 minutes later, he was good. Isn't that amazing that kids do that? Until about 4 hours later, when dinner didn't stay put and pain returned, and there was maybe something that wasn't quite right. Isn't it funny how hard it is to see clearly when the stakes are high and it involves someone you love? My husband and I both had medical training, years of it. I had experience with kids, seeing them with the stomach bug and maybe food poisoning. Those things I knew, but I'd never seen a kid where the top of the list was something seriously wrong inside. That was book knowledge. And so under the dim dome light of the car, as we checked him out, we made that decision to start this process of an ER visit and then an ambulance transfer and then a major surgery later, which would reveal the tiny hole that had been poked in his intestine when that handlebar hit the gut. Parents will never rest easy again, will you? It doesn't happen that often. Except there were 2 other kids in the hospital with similar things at the same time, and they were all 7-year-old boys. So anyway, but it could have been bad. Had we waited another day or 2, it could have been bad. What happened, though, in the process is I noticed that book knowledge became experience. Like, I will never again see a kiddo who tells me that they've got a handlebar to the gut without thinking and wondering through my mind, could that be? And being sure that I don't miss that. It's hard to see clearly. When we get a front row seat to a time that it's hard to see clearly and we see it through the eyes of someone we love, things change. And so this morning, we've been in the Servant King for about 8 weeks, and we've seen snapshots of Jesus in the life of people. And we've seen that he didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to pour himself out for you and me, to die for us, to serve for us. And yet this morning, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take the long view of Jesus. We're going to invite you into a front row seat of Jesus, the servant king, through the eyes of a man named Simon Peter. Now, Simon Peter, I love Simon Peter. We're going to watch him through when he first meets Jesus and through all his successes and failures. We're going to see when it matters that he is able to see clearly in that darkest hour, when he needs to see Jesus clearly and he needs to see himself clearly. And his book knowledge needs to become experiential, deep love and trust that can carry him through. We need that front row seat, all of us. Maybe it's that time of difficulty and crisis and high stakes is now. And you find yourself in a place where you need to hear from him and you need to know him. Peter's story, Simon Peter's story, is a story of hope for you. That Jesus never abandons you and that he's always pursuing you. Or maybe you're in a place where, hey, things seem really good. I'm hearing from him, like I know him, and everything is good. Pay attention. Because it's not always going to be that way. And now is the time when you get to take notes and tuck them away and pull them out when the time is ripe for you to need to remember when the lights go out. Yeah. So we're gonna be looking at the life of Peter. I invite you to join in and just walk in his sandals with me. We're going to be all over the Gospels, Mark and Luke and John. Try to follow along if you can on the screen as we unfold the life of Simon Peter. So Simon and his brother Andrew grew up in this northern part of the Sea of Galilee, in this place just where the Jordan River comes in, and it's fertile and it's beautiful, and the fishing there is like no other. And so Simon and Andrew would grow up as fishermen in this place. And to be a fisherman meant that you were gritty and you were resourceful and that you were hardworking and you had stamina because you fish at night most of the time. And so Simon and Andrew grew up as fishermen. They were savvy about many things, but they were especially savvy about the sea, because the Sea of Galilee was just this 7 by 13 mile kind of pond, not that big and not that impressive, but boy, the right wind and temperatures could cause that place to be deadly in a moment. And so they had to think fast and they had to act fast. And as they did that, Peter developed some confidence. So much confidence. Do you know people like that? I do. I'm like that sometimes. Peter had confidence, so much of it, and it would get him into trouble at times. When I watch Tom Cruise in a movie, I'm like, he must be like Peter, because he's doing all his own stunts and he has this perfect running form, right? But he would be the first one in, and sometimes in Enneagram 6 fashion, he would be the first one out when things got tough. Sometimes he couldn't stay in the game. He wanted to be on the front row seat of the class because he wanted to know everything. And he also, like many of us, wanted to pass the test, right? He could be impulsive, enthusiastic, outspoken. He had a foot-shaped mouth. But here's what I love about Peter is Peter wanted to know, and he was honest, and he would be quick to admit his failures. Maybe part of that came out of his religious life because Peter and his family were observing Jews. They worshiped Yahweh. They observed the Sabbath. They knew when it was okay ethically to fish and throw in your net when someone else had seen those fish first. So he was a religious guy. But he wasn't so much interested in this man he'd heard of named Jesus. Yeah, you hear a lot about Peter, don't you? But you don't hear too much about his brother Andrew. It would be Andrew, his brother, who would hear about Jesus and would take strides to go and follow him. And the minute he met him and knew he was Messiah, the first thing he did was he went back home and he grabbed his brother Peter and he said, Peter, come with me, I've met Messiah. Maybe you are here with an Andrew today. And you're not even sure why you're here, but this person named Andrew or Andrea has brought you. And I just want you to know that God is at work in that. Will you pay attention? Or maybe you are an Andrew or an Andrea to someone. What a precious, precious privilege you have to be in someone's life. I heard a story about that just today as I was walking in. Somebody has walked along someone, brought them to Jesus, and they've been friends for 11 years. Here in this place, growing in Jesus. What a precious thing. So it would be Andrew who would bring Simon Peter to Jesus, and they would meet for the first time, eye to eye, face to face, and it would be significant. And here's the conversation. We find it in John chapter 1, verse 42. Jesus looked at Simon Peter, and he said, you are Simon, son of John. He knows him. He knows you. He knows me. He knows your family, son of John. He said, you will be called Cephas. Like he changes his name. Why does he change his name? Because he gives him a new identity. He wants us to walk in a new identity that he alone gives us. Cephas means Peter. Peter means rock. No longer wavering. No longer unsure. No longer confident in yourself, but standing on this rock. Peter, that's who you are. We meet Jesus and we have this profound encounter with him where our identity has been changed and we think, oh my word, our life is just going to be transformed from here on out. We were going to be, kind now and gentle and loving and patient and all those things. And what does Peter do? It should be profound, right? He goes back to fishing. Yeah, isn't that true? And we don't criticize him for that because what we know is that this is a story. It's the beginning of a story, as it often is. It's not impossible for those transformations to happen at the very beginning of your story. Maybe that's your truth. But more often, it's a story that's being written by God, and it's messier, and it takes longer than anyone thinks. So I want to encourage you in that. So Peter's next chapter in the story begins in Luke chapter 5. Jesus has been away. He's been preaching all over the land. He's been drawing people to himself. Peter has heard about some of those things. And Jesus ends up back at the north part of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Peter and Andrew have been fishing, and they've been fishing all night long. It's been a bad night, and they've caught zero, and their livelihood depends on this thing. And so as they see Jesus, Peter looks over, sees Jesus, and maybe if I'm him, I kind of turn away like, oh, I hope he doesn't see me. Like that time that you didn't do your hair or your makeup and you go to the store and you see that one person that you've been trying to impress or meet in the office where you work. Or maybe it's your neighbor who's you see peeking over the fence because you borrowed their weed whacker a year and a half ago and it's still lying in your shed. You don't want to see them. But Jesus wants to see Peter, and there are two boats on the shore, and Peter is standing there exhausted, and he sees Jesus take a step into his boat to find a place to perch, to get away from the crowd and be able to teach. And Jesus has words for Peter. I love Jesus' words for Peter in the time of Peter's exhaustion. Put out a little from the shore, Peter, he says. And Peter does. I love his obedience. He's like, I'm willing to go for this. Yeah. He's exhausted, though, and Jesus is 5 minutes into his 2-hour sermon. And can you imagine being him and being visible from everyone on the shore? It's not like you can really take a snooze, right? So he's attentive, and finally, Jesus calls up the band, and the message is over, and Peter begins to row back into shore, and Jesus has another set of words for Peter. And it's this: Peter, put out into deep water. Let down the nets for the catch. Let down the nets. I just cleaned the nets, Jesus. They're heavy. It takes hours to clean these things. Jesus, you don't even know, you're a carpenter, I'm a fisherman. You don't fish in the middle of the day. Thank you very much. I'm so tired. Oh, please, can't I just go home? Peter obeys. There are times when it's especially difficult to pay attention to what God wants to say to us, when we feel sorry for ourselves, when it's inconvenient, when we think we know better than he does. Peter had all of those things, but he says, if you say so. He's met him, now he's willing to consider him. If you say so, I will put down the nets, and they do. And in that moment of obedience, Peter's eyes were opened. As the nets were filled to overflowing, and the haul of fish was so great that it was impossible even to put them into one boat, they called out their partners, and both boats are taking on water because of the load of fish that Jesus miraculously, divinely directed into their nets. And in that moment, Jesus is a different person to Peter. He sees him as he truly is for the first time. Not as a man who's a teacher in my boat, but as powerful Messiah who has sovereignty even over the fish. And he falls down on his knees in this boat that's drawing on water in the middle of a pile of flopping fish. Do you get that visual? And he says, my Lord and my King. Luke 5, 8 and 9 says, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees. He said, go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. For they saw the catch. Peter also saw himself in the right light for the first time. In the face of Jesus is the only place where we can see ourselves as we truly are. And he falls on his knees. On our knees, we see that Jesus is sovereign. On our knees, we see that he's king, that he's generous, that he's glorious, that he's gentle, he's humble, he's kind. On our knees, we see our need for him. Peter saw his need for him. Scripture doesn't tell us what the rest of that day was about. That doesn't tell us this is crowds were learning, because that passage is not about the sermon and the crowds. It's about Jesus' pursuit of Peter. Just like he pursues you and me. It doesn't feel like that all the time, but it's not an accident that he keeps coming up in your life. It's okay if it seems poorly timed or you can't make sense of it. If somehow it doesn't make sense, if it feels like he's not answering and I've been praying for so long, or if you've been hurt by someone even in the church, or if you're lonely, or things aren't working out for you, or you don't know why Jesus should make a difference in Tacoma in 2023, Jesus is pursuing you. He's pursuing you now. This moment was a fork in the road for Peter. He could go one way and continue to work hard and build his savvy and his strength and to avoid failure as much as possible till the end of his life, or he could find his hope in the servant king and bow to the source of all strength and savvy, and he could find everlasting life. And Jesus chose the latter. Peter chose the latter. Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid." This is verse 10 and 11. "From now on, Peter, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. It was something to follow Jesus. It is something to follow Jesus. In Jesus' day, it would be a rabbi, and it would be students who'd learned scripture since they were age 5, and they'd learn it through about age 13, 14, 15, and they'd find a trade and get married when they were 20. But the best and the brightest, if they could ask a rabbi to teach them, and if that rabbi would take them on, they would follow him, and they would step toward becoming a rabbi. But Jesus was different. He chose his disciples. Jesus was different. It wasn't about the means to an end in a lovely career. It was about being with him and suffering with him and teaching with him and taking that teaching and telling others. Peter had left everything behind. This is what disciples did. Let's not miss the significance of what that is for him. Family, he was married, left behind family, left behind financial security. He left behind being an expert at something to become an intern. It's like, intern here is really healthy and good. I just want you to know that. But sometimes it's not, right? He had everything to learn, and it was a fire hose. He had a lot to unlearn, but it was awesome, and his devotion for Jesus during these years of following him was skyrocketing, and his heart for the master and his teaching was just growing like crazy. We can imagine a phone call home to his wife to check in. "Babe, oh, it's so good to hear your voice. Oh man, yeah, me too. I love you. I miss you so much. But I got to tell you, this Jesus, he's amazing. I've never seen a rabbi like him. Like, he's teaching us about love. Like, God's law, it's not about rituals and rules, but it's about how much we're to love each other and our neighbors." Yeah, even the Reubens. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah. But listen to this, babe. He heals people. Like, he raises people from the dead. He touches them, lepers. Yeah, like they can't walk or talk or see or hear, and they never have been able to, and now they can. It's unbelievable. But it's cool because he's sending us out to do the same. And he wants us to use his name. And when we do, babe, it works. It's like he's there with me. It's like I'm not even doing anything. It's just him doing it through me. It's amazing. He trusts us. Here's the best part. Get a hold of this. You're never going to believe it. I think I'm his favorite. Yeah. Every time we go anywhere, he always wants me first. And even when it's just like a couple of us guys, he always has me right in there. It's really special. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he makes me second in command. Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right. No, I'll be careful because I know my foot-shaped mouth. I did get into a conflict with him. I was about going to Jerusalem. I thought it was a horrible idea. He wanted to go. I didn't think it was a safe thing. He said something about Satan. But we've patched all of that up right now. And get this. He asked me and John and me, if you want to be grammatically correct, to prepare the Passover supper tomorrow night for the whole group. Can you believe it? I'm so excited. It's going to be great. Okay, I really got to go. I love you. I miss you. Bye. Pride goes before destruction. A haughty spirit before a fall. Mark 14:16, the disciples left, went into the city, and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. It was a solemn time. It was intimate. There were difficult words. Jesus would talk about his broken body and his shed blood. Jesus would wrap a towel around himself and wash the disciples' feet. Peter would object before he relented. In that night, not long after, Jesus would speak the hardest words that Peter had yet to hear from him. And they would be the beginning of his unraveling. Mark 14:27, you will all fall away, Jesus told them. I'm Peter. I'm not going to fall away. I'm rock. Why would I fall away? I've given everything to follow you. Jesus says, I know you're Peter. In fact, I know you better than you do. But you will fall away, all of you. But Jesus, I've given everything. It costs everything to be my follower. It costs me everything for you to be my follower. We can seem prideful, unaware, overambitious, just like Peter. I love Peter because I relate to him so much. Most of the time, our intentions are good. In fact, the language fall away is less like throwing rocks at Jesus, and it's more like tripping over them in our path as we follow him. Some of you know that my brother was diagnosed with a blood cancer about 1.5 years ago, and you've prayed for him, and he's better, and so praise God. It's so good. Like cancer does, that diagnosis comes, and it comes quickly, and it just hijacks your life. And I've loved watching my brother David walk through that with such grace and courage. But one thing that came up in the early part of his course was that it was clear that he was going to need to have a bone marrow transplant. And that's not something that's done in every city, and it wasn't done in the city where he and my mom live in Oklahoma. So time, kind of like took place, and my husband and I had conversations, and all the family, the whole thing. And we decided, it's best to have him come here. Why wouldn't he come here? I could be his caregiver, and, it would be good. Mom could come too, and God's provided. It's so good, and we were all so excited, and I am so, so incredibly grateful that we got to do that together. What a wonderful time. What I didn't expect in my naive gung-ho-ness was that it would be so hard. And it would be a time when, like never before, I became so familiar with my sin of irritability and self-centeredness and I don't like Oklahoma food. We're in Washington. Those things. And I never have felt so blind to the obviousness of my sin. Peter had that same blindness. He said, even if all fall away, all of these other 11 might fall away, but I will not fall away. Jesus, you can count on me. Truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, Peter, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. 3 times. Isn't Jesus kind to tell the disciples ahead of time that they'll all fall away? We do chuckle, and it can seem cruel, but it reveals his heart. Luke 22, verse 32 tells us that Jesus has been praying for Peter, that if his faith falls away, when it does, that he would be able to return and strengthen his brothers. Jesus has been praying for Peter. He's been holding him up, and so he wants him to see himself clearly. Later that night, Jesus would be betrayed. He'd be arrested. He'd have a sham court hearing. Peter would follow at a distance. He wanted to know what was going on. What would be going through his mind? If it were me, I'd be thinking he'll get himself out of this one. You should see some of the things he does. Or, why isn't he fighting back? Come on, Jesus, say something. It must have at least been unsettling for him. He had followed Jesus for 3 years. Long time. He'd seen him raise the dead, free people. He'd seen him feed thousands and care for people and touch lepers and every nationality, every social strata. He'd seen miracles by the hands of Jesus, by his power. He'd seen him enter Jerusalem like a king. He'd seen him bow down as a servant. No one in all of Jesus' disciples, among all of them, had had a front row seat to Jesus' life like Peter had. And in a moment, The words of a servant girl would cause him to deny it all. A servant girl would cause him to deny it all. Mark 14:67. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You were also with that Nazarene Jesus," she said, but he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you're one of them, for you're a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. It's just hard not to have in mind some of our failures in that moment. It's hard for me. It's hard to prepare, knowing my own failures. We'd rather not imagine being Peter. We'd rather rationalize and say, like, hey, he was afraid. I get it. Or like, hey, he's kind of defending himself, right? I get it. Or, hey, like, why are we picking on Peter? All the disciples abandoned him. Why him? We might add that we're no better, and it's true in a variety of ways. Peter's worst fears would come to pass. He would see the master would be tried. He'd be sentenced. He'd be crucified. Peter would be in hiding as his master spoke his last words, took his last breaths. Everything he thought was good and true was gone. His shame was overwhelming. He was such a failure. We can be grateful to Peter. He has shown us the inevitability of failure as we follow Jesus. That even when we feel our commitment to Jesus is rock solid, that we find that we fail when things get tough. We fall away from our fears, our overconfidence, our desires for control, our self-sufficiency, whatever it is that we will fail. But there's one more encounter that as we see Jesus resurrected, and we're going to celebrate that in the next 2 weeks, we're going to look to Easter, we're going to walk through Holy Week, and it's going to be a party. And yet there's one more encounter that Jesus has with Peter that speaks volumes. Band, you can come up. We're going to find it in John chapter 21. It's after the resurrection, and all of the disciples have seen Jesus at some point by now. And so they are hopeful, and yet they are carrying the weight of the events of this last several days. Some of them are up near the Sea of Galilee, and Peter, in classic fashion, says, hey, let's go fishing, because that's what he knows to do. When things are hard, do what's comfortable. He goes fishing, and they're out all night, and in a classic deja vu moment, they catch nothing, and they're tired. And they hear a voice from the shore that says, hey, try the other side of the boat. It's like, oh, that makes tons of sense. But they try the other side of the boat, and the fish are overwhelmingly just coming on board in this net. And Peter realizes that it's the master. And so he, in classic Peter form, impulsively jumps in the water and he swims to shore. He wants to see Jesus, and he's ambivalent because he's covered with shame. But he wants to see Jesus. Jesus is cooking breakfast. He's a servant king. And in this dialogue that's so tender between Jesus and Peter, Jesus says to him, do you love me, Peter? Like, do you really love me? The word he uses there is agape. Do you 100% godly give it all for me, Peter? And Peter says, Jesus, you know I love you. But Peter uses this word phileo. It's like 60% love. It's like friendship, buddy kind of love. And Peter can't look Jesus in the eye anymore and say, like, you know I 100% love you, Jesus, because he's known his failure. He's seen himself in the correct light at the feet of Jesus. But he says, I can give you 60%. And in his mind, he's thinking like, he'll never love me again. He'll never expect any kind of like virtue from me again. He'll never ask me to do the things that I had so much life in as I was following him. He'll never trust me again. I'll never have that special relationship with him again. And Jesus in that moment says, feed my sheep. Peter, I have something for you to do. I'm not going to leave you behind for failures. I want you with me. Peter, again, Jesus says, Peter, do you 100% love me? And Peter's hurt. And he says, Jesus, you know I 60% love you. Jesus is affirming who Peter is. And he's saying to him, like, I see your failures. I know where you've been. I'm never going to leave you behind. Every time you leave me, I'm going to come pursuing you. I'm going to invite you back. A third time. Do you 100% love me, Peter? Yes, Lord, you know that I 60% love you. Jesus says, take care of my sheep. In the presence of Jesus, Peter realizes that no matter how many times he leaves Jesus, Jesus will always come after him. And in this moment, this tender moment, in this familiar place where Peter first dropped on his knees in front of Messiah and said, Lord, I'm a sinful man. Jesus looks him in the eye, calls him by his name, Simon, says, I can let you be Simon until you're ready to be Peter. I receive your 60% love. He says, take care of my sheep. Follow me. You know, maybe the failures in your life, like the failures in my life, keep you from embracing and understanding the passionate, devoted, never-ending love of Jesus for you. It's not tolerant, it is a deep love, and he wants you with him. Maybe the failures that you've had have been big by standards. Maybe they've been small. Maybe it's just like, I'm just so like snarky all the time and with my family and those things. Like Jesus sees you. And he invites you to follow him. He has some work for you to do. He has something important that's eternal for you to do. And he sees you right where we are. You know, Jesus not only sees our failures, but he takes our failures on. And he does that on the cross as he spreads his arms and his body is broken for you and me. And his blood pours out for you and me. And he takes our failures on him. And he says, like, I see you, I love you. His love never ends. We're going to move into a time of communion where we're going to celebrate the broken body and the blood poured out by Jesus for all of us. So I invite you to join in that. There are prayer stations on each side of the room. I would invite you to listen to what God is saying to you. If you have something that you want to process with somebody who can pray for you, to just go and receive prayer, or to ask questions about what could this be that's stirring in my soul, I invite you to go to the prayer stations during this next song and to ask for prayer. God will meet you in that place. Jesus will never leave you. He'll never abandon you. He wants you with him.